The Last Test by H.P. Lovecraft and Adolphe de Castro. Chapter 1. Few persons know the inside of the Clarendon story, or even that there is an inside not reached by the newspapers. It was a San Francisco sensation in the days before the fire, both because of the panic and menace that kept it company, and because of its close linkage with the governor of the state. Governor Dalton, it will be recalled, was Clarendon's best friend, and later married his sister. Neither Dalton nor Mrs. Dalton would ever discuss the painful affair, but somehow the facts have leaked out to a limited circle. But for that and for the years which have given a sort of vagueness and impersonality to the actors, one would still pause before probing into secrets so strictly guarded at the time. The appointment of Dr. Alfred Clarendon as medical director of San Quentin Penitentiary was greeted with the keenest enthusiasm throughout California. San Francisco had at last the honor of harboring one of the greatest biologists and physicians of the period, and solid pathological leaders from all over the world might be expected to flock thither to study his methods, profit by his advice and researches, and learn how to cope with their own local problems. California, almost overnight, would become a center of medical scholarship with earthwide influence and reputation. Governor Dalton, anxious to spread the news in its fullest significance, saw to it that the press carried ample and dignified accounts of his new appointee. Pictures of Dr. Clarendon and his new home near Old Goat Hill, sketches of his career and manifold honors, and popular accounts of his salient scientific discoveries were all presented in the principal California dailies, till the public soon felt a sort of reflected pride in the man whose studies of pyemia in India, of the pest in China, and of every sort of kindred disorder elsewhere, would soon enrich the world of medicine with an antitoxin of revolutionary importance. A basic antitoxin combating the whole febrile principle at its very source, and ensuring the ultimate conquest and extirpation of fever in all its diverse forms. Back of the appointment stretched an extended and not wholly unromantic history of early friendship, long separation, and dramatically renewed acquaintance. James Dalton and the Clarendon family had been friends in New York 10 years before. Friends and more than friends, since the doctor's only sister, Georgina, was the sweetheart of Dalton's youth, while the doctor himself had been his closest associate and almost his protégé in the days of school and college. The father of Alfred and Georgina, a Wall Street pirate of the ruthless elder breed, had known Dalton's father well. So well, indeed, that he had finally stripped him of all he possessed in a memorable afternoon's fight on the stock exchange. Dalton Sr., hopeless of recuperation and wishing to give his one adored child the benefit of his insurance, had promptly ended himself. But James had not sought to retaliate. It was, as he viewed it, all in the game, and he wished no harm to the father of the girl he meant to marry, and of the budding young scientist whose admirer and protector he had been throughout their years of fellowship and study. Instead, he turned to the law, established himself in a small way, and in due course of time asked Old Clarendon for Georgina's hand. Old Clarendon had refused very firmly and loudly, vowing that no pauper and upstart lawyer was fit to be his son-in-law, and a scene of considerable violence had occurred. James, telling the wrinkled freebooter at last what he ought to have been told long before, had left the house and the city in a high temper, and was embarked within a month upon the California life, which was to lead him to the governorship through many a fight with ring and politician. His farewells to Alfred and Georgina had been brief, and he had never known the aftermath of that scene in the Clarendon library. Only by a day did he miss the news of old Clarendon's death from apoplexy, and by so missing it, changed the course of his whole career. He had not written Georgina in the decade that followed, knowing her loyalty to her father, and waiting till his own fortune and position might remove all obstacles to the match. Nor had he sent any word to Alfred, whose calm indifference in the face of affection and hero worship had always savoured of conscious destiny and the self-sufficiency of genius. Secure in the ties of a constancy rare even then, he had worked and risen with thoughts only of the future, still a bachelor, and with a perfect intuitive faith that Georgina also was waiting. In this faith, Dalton was not deceived. Wondering perhaps why no message ever came, Georgina found no romance save in her dreams and expectations, and in the course of time became busy with the new responsibilities brought by her brother's rise to greatness. Alfred's growth had not belied the promise of his youth, and the slim boy had darted quietly up the steps of science with a speed and permanence almost dizzying to contemplate. Lean and ascetic, with steel-rimmed pince-nez and pointed brown beard, Dr. Alfred Clarendon was an authority at 25 and an international figure at 30. Careless of worldly affairs with the negligence of genius, he depended vastly on the care and management of his sister, and was secretly thankful that her memories of James had kept her from other and more tangible alliances. Georgina conducted the business and household of the great bacteriologist, and was proud of his strides toward the conquest of fever. She bore patiently with his eccentricities, calmed his occasional bursts of fanaticism, and healed those breaches with his friends, which now and then resulted from his unconcealed scorn of anything less than a single-minded devotion to pure truth and its progress. Clarendon was undeniably irritating at times to ordinary folk, for he never tired of depreciating the service of the individual as contrasted with the service of mankind as a whole, and in censuring men of learning who mingled domestic life or outside interests with their pursuit of abstract science. His enemies called him a bore, but his admirers, pausing before the white heat of ecstasy into which he would work himself, became almost ashamed of ever having any standards or aspirations outside the one divine sphere of unalloyed knowledge. The doctor's travels were extensive, and Georgina generally accompanied him on the shorter ones. 3 times, however, he had taken long, lone jaunts to strange and distant places in his studies of exotic fevers and half-fabulous plagues, for he knew that it is out of the unknown lands of cryptic and immemorial Asia that most of the earth's diseases spring. On each of these occasions he had brought back curious mementos which added to the eccentricity of his home, not least among which was the needlessly large staff of Tibetan servants picked up somewhere in Yusang during an epidemic of which the world never heard, but amidst which Clarendon had discovered and isolated the germ of black fever. These men, taller than most Tibetans and clearly belonging to a stock but little investigated in the outside world, were of a skeletonic leanness which made one wonder whether the doctor had sought to symbolize in them the anatomical models of his college years. Their aspect, in the loose black silk robes of Bonpar priests which he chose to give them, was grotesque in the highest degree, and there was an unsmiling silence and stiffness in their motions which enhanced their air of fantasy, and gave Georgina a queer, awed feeling of having stumbled into the pages of Vathek or the Arabian Nights. But queerest of all was the general factotum or clinic man, whom Clarendon addressed as Surama, and whom he had brought back with him after a long stay in northern Africa, during which he had studied certain odd intermittent fevers among the mysterious Saharan Tuaregs, whose descent from the primal race of lost Atlantis is an old archaeological rumour. Surama, a man of great intelligence and seemingly inexhaustible erudition, was as morbidly lean as the Tibetan servants, with swarthy, parchment-like skin drawn so tightly over his bald pate and hairless face that every line of the skull stood out in ghastly prominence, this death's head effect being heightened by lustrelessly burning black eyes set with a depth which left to common visibility only a pair of dark, vacant sockets. Unlike the ideal subordinate, he seemed, despite his impassive features, to spend no effort in concealing such emotions as he possessed. Instead, he carried about an insidious atmosphere of irony or amusement, accompanied at certain moments by a deep, guttural chuckle like that of a giant turtle which has just torn to pieces some furry animal and is ambling away toward the sea. His race appeared to be Caucasian, but could not be classified more closely than that. Some of Clarendon's friends thought he looked like a high-caste Hindu notwithstanding his accentless speech, while many agreed with Georgina, who disliked him, when she gave her opinion that a pharaoh's mummy, if miraculously brought to life, would form a very apt twin for this sardonic skeleton. Dalton, absorbed in his uphill political battles and isolated from Eastern interests through the peculiar self-sufficiency of the Old West, had not followed the meteoric rise of his former comrade. Clarendon had actually heard nothing of one so far outside his chosen world of science as the governor. Being of independent and even of abundant means, the Clarendons had for many years stuck to their old Manhattan mansion in East 19th Street, whose ghosts must have looked sorely askance at the bizarrerie of Sarama and the Thebetans. Then, through the doctor's wish to transfer his base of medical observation, the great change had suddenly come, and they had crossed the continent to take up a secluded life in San Francisco, buying the gloomy old banister place near Goat Hill, overlooking the bay, and establishing their strange household in a rambling French-roofed relic of mid-Victorian design and gold rush parvenu display, set amidst high-walled grounds in a region still half suburban. Dr. Clarendon, though better satisfied than in New York, still felt cramped for lack of opportunities to apply and test his pathological theories. Unworldly as he was, he had never thought of using his reputation as an influence to gain public appointment, though more and more he realized that only the medical directorship of a government or a charitable institution, a prison, almshouse, or hospital, would give him a field of sufficient width to complete his researches and make his discoveries of the greatest use to humanity and science at large. Then he had run into James Dalton by sheer accident one afternoon in Market Street as the governor was swinging out of the Royal Hotel. Georgina had been with him, and an almost instant recognition had heightened the drama of the reunion. Mutual ignorance of one another's progress had bred long explanation and histories, and Clarendon was pleased to find that he had so important an official for a friend. Dalton and Georgina, exchanging many a glance, felt more than a trace of their youthful tenderness, and a friendship was then and there revived, which led to frequent calls and a fuller and fuller exchange of confidences. James Dalton learned of his old protégé's need for political appointment and sought, true to his protective role of school and college days, to devise some means of giving little Alf the needed position and scope. He had, it is true, wide appointive powers, but the legislature's constant attacks and encroachments forced him to exercise these with the utmost discretion. At length, however, scarcely 3 months after the sudden reunion, the foremost institutional medical office in the state fell vacant. Weighing all the elements with care, and conscious that his friend's achievements and reputation would justify the most substantial rewards, the governor felt at last able to act. Formalities were few, and on the 8th of November, Dr. Alfred Schuyler Clarendon became medical director of the California State Penitentiary at San Quentin. Chapter 2. In scarcely more than a month, the hopes of Dr. Clarendon's admirers were amply fulfilled. Sweeping changes in methods brought to the prison's medical routine an efficiency never before dreamed of. And though the subordinates were naturally not without jealousy, they were obliged to admit the magical results of a really great man's superintendence. Then came a time where mere appreciation might well have grown to devout thankfulness at a providential conjunction of time, place, and man. For one morning, Dr. Jones came to his new chief with a grave face to announce his discovery of a case which he could not but identify as that self-same black fever whose germ Clarendon had found and classified. Dr. Clarendon showed no surprise, but kept on at the writing before him. "I know," he said evenly. "I came across that case yesterday. I'm glad you recognized it. Put the man in a separate ward, though I don't believe this fever is contagious." Dr. Jones, with his own opinion of the malady's contagiousness, was glad of this deference to caution and hastened to execute the order. Upon his return, Clarendon rose to leave, declaring that he would himself take charge of the case alone. Disappointed in his wish to study the great man's methods and technique, the junior physician watched his chief stride away toward the lone ward where he had placed the patient, more critical of the new regime than at any time since admiration had displaced his first jealous pangs. Reaching the ward, Clarendon entered hastily, glancing at the bed and stepping back to see how far Dr. Jones's obvious curiosity might have led him. Then, finding the corridor still vacant, he shut the door and turned to examine the sufferer. The man was a convict of a peculiarly repulsive type and seemed to be racked by the keenest throes of agony. His features were frightfully contracted, and his knees drawn sharply up in the mute desperation of the stricken. Clarendon studied him closely, raising his tightly shut eyelids, took his pulse and temperature, and finally dissolving a tablet in water, forced the solution between the sufferer's lips. Before long, the height of the attack abated, as shown by the relaxing body and returning normality of expression, and the patient began to breathe more easily. Then, by a soft rubbing of the ears, the doctor caused the man to open his eyes. There was life in them, for they moved from side to side, though they lacked the fine fire which we are wont to deem the image of the soul. Clarendon smiled as he surveyed the peace his help had brought, feeling behind him the power of an all-capable science. He had long known of this case, and had snatched the victim from death with the work of a moment. Another hour and this man would have gone. Yet Jones had seen the symptoms for days before discovering them, and having discovered them, did not know what to do. Man's conquest of disease, however, cannot be perfect. Clarendon, assuring the dubious trusty nurses that the fever was not contagious, had had the patient bathed, sponged in alcohol, and put to bed, but was told the next morning that the case was lost. The man had died after midnight in the most intense agony, and with such cries and distortions of face that the nurses were driven almost to panic. The doctor took this news with his usual calm, whatever his scientific feelings may have been, and ordered the burial of the patient in quicklime. Then, with a philosophic shrug of the shoulders, he made the usual rounds of the penitentiary. 2 days later, the prison was hit again. 3 men came down at once this time, and there was no concealing the fact that a black fever epidemic was underway. Clarendon, having adhered so firmly to his theory of non-contagiousness, suffered a distinct loss of prestige, and was handicapped by the refusal of the trusty nurses to attend the patients. Theirs was not the soul-free devotion of those who sacrificed themselves to science and humanity. They were convicts, serving only because of the privileges they could not otherwise buy, and when the price became too great, they preferred to resign the privileges. But the doctor was still master of the situation. Consulting with the warden and sending urgent messages to his friend the governor, he saw to it that special rewards in cash and in reduced terms were offered to the convicts for the dangerous nursing service, and by this method succeeded in getting a very fair quota of volunteers. He was steeled for action now, and nothing could shake his poise and determination. Additional cases brought only a curt nod, and he seemed a stranger to fatigue as he hastened from bedside to bedside all over the vast stone home of sadness and evil. More than 40 cases developed within another week, and nurses had to be brought from the city. Clarendon went home very seldom at this stage, often sleeping on a cot in the warden's quarters, and always giving himself up with typical abandon to the service of medicine and of mankind. Then came the first mutterings of that storm which was soon to convulse San Francisco. News will out, and the menace of black fever spread over the town like a fog from the bay. Reporters trained in the doctrine of sensation first used their imagination without restraint, and gloried when at last they were able to produce a case in the Mexican Quarter which a local physician, fonder perhaps of money than of truth or civic welfare, pronounced black fever. That was the last straw. Frantic at the thought of the crawling death so close upon them, the people of San Francisco went mad en masse and embarked upon that historic exodus of which all the country was soon to hear over busy wires. Ferries and rowboats, excursion steamers and launches, railways and cable cars, bicycles and carriages, moving vans and work carts, all were pressed into instant and frenzied service. Sausalito and Tamalpais, as lying in the direction of San Quentin, shared in the flight, while housing space in Oakland, Berkeley, and Alameda rose to fabulous prices. Tent colonies sprang up, and improvised villages lined the crowded southward highways from Millbrae to San Jose. Many sought refuge with friends in Sacramento, while the fright-shaken residue forced by various causes to stay behind could do little more than maintain the basic necessities of a nearly dead city. Business, save for quack doctors with sure cures and preventives for use against the fever, fell rapidly to the vanishing point. At first the saloons offered medicated drinks, but soon found that the populace preferred to be duped by charlatans of more professional aspect. In strangely noiseless streets, persons peered into one another's faces to glimpse possible plague symptoms, and shopkeepers began more and more to refuse admission to their clientele, each customer seeming to them a fresh fever menace. Legal and judicial machinery began to disintegrate as attorneys and county clerks succumbed one by one to the urge for flight. Even the doctors deserted in large numbers, many of them pleading the need of vacations among the mountains and the lakes in the northern part of the state. Schools and colleges, theatres and cafes, restaurants and saloons all gradually closed their doors. And in a single week, San Francisco lay prostrate and inert, with only its light, power and water service even half normal, with newspapers in skeletonic form, and with a crippled parody on transportation maintained by the horse and cable cars. This was the lowest ebb. It could not last long, for courage and observation are not altogether dead in mankind, and sooner or later, the non-existence of any widespread black fever epidemic outside San Quentin became too obvious a fact to deny, notwithstanding several actual cases and the undeniable spread of typhoid in the unsanitary suburban tent colonies. The leaders and editors of the community conferred and took action, enlisting in their service the very reporters whose energies had done so much to bring on the trouble, but now turning their sensation-first avidity into more constructive channels. Editorials and fictitious interviews appeared, telling of Dr. Clarendon's complete control of the disease and of the absolute impossibility of its diffusion beyond the prison walls. Reiteration and circulation slowly did their work, and gradually a slim backward trickle of urbanites swelled into a vigorous refluent stream. One of the first healthy symptoms was the start of a newspaper controversy of the approved acrimonious kind, attempting to fix blame for the panic wherever the various participants thought it belonged. The returning doctors, jealously strengthened by their timely vacations, began striking at Clarendon, assuring the public that they as well as he would keep the fever in leash, and censuring him for not doing even more to check its spread within San Quentin. Clarendon had, they averred, permitted far more deaths than were necessary. The veriest tyro in medicine knew how to check fever contagion, and if this renowned savant did not do it, it was clearly because he chose for scientific reasons to study the final effects of the disease, rather than to prescribe properly and save the victims. This policy, they insinuated, might be proper enough among convicted murderers in a penal institution, but it would not do in San Francisco, where life was still a precious and sacred thing. Thus they went on, and the papers were glad to publish all they wrote, since the sharpness of the campaign, in which Dr. Clarendon would doubtless join, would help to obliterate confusion and restore confidence among the people. But Clarendon did not reply. He only smiled, while his singular clinic man Sarama indulged in many a deep, testudinous chuckle. He was at home more nowadays, so that reporters began besieging the gate of the great wall the doctor had built around his house, instead of pestering the warden's office at San Quentin. Results, though, were equally meagre, for Sarama formed an impassable barrier between the doctor and the outer world, even after the reporters had got into the grounds. The newspaper men getting access to the front hall had glimpses of Clarendon's singular entourage and made the best they could in a write-up of Sarama and the queer skeletonic Tibetans. Exaggeration, of course, occurred in every fresh article, and the net effect of the publicity was distinctly adverse to the great physician. Most persons hate the unusual, and hundreds who could have excused heartlessness or incompetence stood ready to condemn the grotesque taste manifested in the chuckling attendant and the 8 black-robed men. Early in January, an especially persistent young man from the Observer climbed the moated 8-foot brick wall in the rear of the Clarendon grounds and began a survey of the varied outdoor appearances which trees concealed from the front walk. With quick, alert brain, he took in everything: the rose arbor, the aviaries, the animal cages where all sorts of mammalia from monkeys to guinea pigs might be seen and heard, the stout wooden clinic building with barred windows in the northwest corner of the yard, and bent searching glances throughout the 1,000 square feet of intramural privacy. A great article was brewing, and he would have escaped unscathed but for the barking of Dick, Georgina Clarendon's gigantic and beloved St. Bernard. Sarama, instant in his response, had the youth by the collar before a protest could be uttered, and was presently shaking him as a terrier shakes a rat and dragging him through the trees to the front yard and the gate. Breathless explanations and quavering demands to see Dr. Clarendon were useless. Sarama only chuckled and dragged his victim on. Suddenly, a positive fright crept over the dapper scribe, and he began to wish desperately that this unearthly creature would speak, if only to prove that he really was a being of honest flesh and blood belonging to this planet. He became deathly sick and strove not to glimpse the eyes which he knew must lie at the base of those gaping black sockets. Soon he heard the gate open and felt himself propelled violently through. In another moment waking rudely to the things of earth as he landed wetly and muddily in the ditch, which Clarendon had dug around the entire length of the wall. Fright gave a place to rage as he heard the massive gate slam shut, and he rose dripping to shake his fist at the forbidding portal. Then, as he turned to go, a soft sound grated behind him, and through a small wicket in the gate he felt the sunken eyes of Sarama and heard the echoes of a deep-voiced, blood-freezing chuckle. This young man, feeling perhaps justly that his handling had been rougher than he deserved, resolved to revenge himself upon the household responsible for his treatment. Accordingly, he prepared a fictitious interview with Dr. Clarendon, supposed to be held in the clinic building, during which he was careful to describe the agonies of a dozen black fever patients whom his imagination ranged on orderly rows of couches. His masterstroke was the picture of one especially pathetic sufferer gasping for water, while the doctor held a glass of the sparkling fluid just out of his reach, in a scientific attempt to determine the effect of a tantalizing emotion on the course of the disease. This invention was followed by paragraphs of insinuating comment so outwardly respectful that it bore a double venom. Dr. Clarendon was, the article ran, undoubtedly the greatest and most single-minded scientist in the world. But science is no friend to individual welfare, and one would not like to have one's gravest ills drawn out and aggravated merely to satisfy an investigator on some point of abstract truth. Life is too short for that. Altogether, the article was diabolically skillful, and succeeded in horrifying 9 readers out of 10 against Dr. Clarendon and his supposed methods. Other papers were quick to copy and enlarge upon its substance, taking the cue it offered, and commencing a series of faked interviews which fairly ran the gamut of derogatory fantasy. In no case, however, did the doctor condescend to offer a contradiction. He had no time to waste on fools and liars, and cared little for the esteem of a thoughtless rabble he despised. When James Dalton telegraphed his regrets and offered aid, Clarendon replied with an almost boorish curtness. He did not heed the barking of dogs and could not bother to muzzle them, nor would he thank anyone for messing with a matter wholly beneath notice. Silent and contemptuous, he continued his duties with tranquil evenness. But the young reporter's spark had done its work. San Francisco was insane again, and this time as much with rage as with fear. Sober judgment became a lost art, and though no second exodus occurred, there ensued a reign of vice and recklessness born of desperation and suggesting parallel phenomena in medieval times of pestilence. Hatred ran riot against the man who had found the disease and was struggling to restrain it, and a light-headed public forgot his great services to knowledge in their efforts to fan the flames of resentment. They seemed in their blindness to hate him in person, rather than the plague which had come to their breeze-cleaned and usually healthy city. Then the young reporter, playing in the neuronic fire he had kindled, added a crowning personal touch of his own. Remembering the indignities he had suffered at the hands of the cadaverous clinic man, he prepared a masterly article on the home and environment of Dr. Clarendon, giving a special prominence to Surama, whose very aspect he declared sufficient to scare the healthiest person into any sort of fever. He tried to make the gaunt chuckler appear equally ridiculous and terrible, succeeding best perhaps in the latter half of his intention, since a tide of horror always welled up whenever he thought of his brief proximity to the man. He collected all the rumours current about the man, elaborated on the unholy depth of his reputed scholarship, and hinted darkly that it could have been no godly realm of secret and eon-weighted Africa wherein Dr. Clarendon had found him. Georgina, who followed the papers closely, felt crushed and hurt by these attacks upon her brother, but James Dalton, who called often at the house, did his best to comfort her. In this he was warm and sincere, for he wished not only to console the woman he loved, but to utter some measure of the reverence he had always felt for the starward-bound genius who had been his youth's closest comrade. He told Georgina how greatness can never be exempted from the shafts of envy, and cited the long, sad list of splendid brains crushed beneath vulgar heels. The attacks, he pointed out, formed the truest of all proofs of Alfred's solid eminence.
"But they hurt just the same,"
she rejoined.
"and all the more because I know that Al really suffers from them, no matter how indifferent he tries to be."
Dalton kissed her hand in a manner not then obsolete among well-born persons.
"And it hurts me 1,000 times more, knowing that it hurts you and Alf. But never mind, Georgie. We'll stand together and pull through it."
Thus it came about that Georgina came more and more to rely on the strength of the steel-firm, square-jawed governor who had been her youthful swain, and more to confide in him the things she feared. The press attacks and the epidemic were not quite all. There were aspects of the household which she did not like. Surama, cruel in equal measure to man and beast, filled her with the most unnameable repulsion, and she could not but feel that he meant some vague, indefinable harm to Alfred. She did not like the Thibetans either, and thought it very peculiar that Surama was able to talk with them. Alfred would not tell her who or what Surama was, but had once explained rather haltingly that he was a much older man than would be commonly thought credible, and that he had mastered secrets and been through experiences calculated to make him a colleague of phenomenal value for any scientist seeking nature's hidden mysteries. Urged by her uneasiness, Dalton became a still more frequent visitor at the Clarendon home, though he saw that his presence was deeply resented by Surama. The bony clinic man formed the habit of glaring peculiarly from those spectral sockets when admitting him, and would often, after closing the gate when he left, chuckle monotonously in a manner that made his flesh creep. Meanwhile, Dr. Clarendon seemed oblivious of everything save his work at San Quentin, whither he went each day in his launch, alone save for Surama, who managed the wheel while the doctor read or collated his notes. Dalton welcomed these regular absences, for they gave him constant opportunities to renew his suit for Georgina's hand. When he would overstay and meet Alfred, however, the latter's greeting was always friendly, despite his habitual reserve. In time, the engagement of James and Georgina grew to be a definite thing, and the two awaited only a favourable chance to speak to Alfred. The governor, whole-souled in everything and firm in his protective loyalty, spared no pains in spreading propaganda on his old friend's behalf. Press and officialdom both felt his influence, and he even succeeded in interesting scientists in the East, many of whom came to California to study the plague and investigate the anti-fever bacillus, which Clarendon was so rapidly isolating and perfecting. These doctors and biologists, however, did not obtain the information they wished, so that several of them left with a very unfortunate impression. Not a few prepared articles hostile to Clarendon, accusing him of an unscientific and fame-seeking attitude, and intimating that he concealed his methods through a highly unprofessional desire for ultimate personal profit. Others, fortunately, were more liberal in their judgments and wrote enthusiastically of Clarendon and his work. They had seen the patients and could appreciate how marvellously he held the dread disease in leash. His secrecy regarding the antitoxin they deemed quite justifiable, since its public diffusion in unperfected form could not but do more harm than good. Clarendon himself, whom many of their number had met before, impressed them more profoundly than ever, and they did not hesitate to compare him with Jenner, Lister, Koch, Pasteur, Metchnikoff, and the rest of those whose whole lives have served pathology and humanity. Dalton was careful to save for Alfred all the magazines that spoke well of him, bringing them in person as an excuse to see Georgina. They did not, however, produce much effect save a contemptuous smile, and Clarendon would generally throw them to Sarama, whose deep, disturbing chuckle upon reading formed a close parallel to the doctor's own ironic amusement. One Monday evening early in February, Dalton called with the definite intention of asking Clarendon for his sister's hand. Georgina herself admitted him to the grounds, and as they walked toward the house, he stopped to pat the great dog, which rushed up and laid friendly forepaws on his breast. It was Dick, Georgina's cherished Saint Bernard, and Dalton was glad to feel that he had the affection of a creature which meant so much to her. Dick was excited and glad, and turned the governor nearly half about with his vigorous pressure as he gave a soft, quick bark and sprang off through the trees toward the clinic. He did not vanish, though, but presently stopped and looked back, softly barking again as if he wished Dalton to follow. Georgina, fond of obeying her huge pet's playful whims, motioned to James to see what he wanted, and they both walked slowly after him as he trotted relievedly to the rear of the yard where the top of the clinic building stood silhouetted against the stars above the great brick wall. The outline of lights within showed around the edges of the dark window curtains, so they knew that Alfred and Sarama were at work. Suddenly, from the interior came a thin, subdued sound, like a cry of a child, a plaintive call of, "Mama, Mama!" at which Dick barked, while James and Georgina started perceptibly. Then Georgina smiled, remembering the parrots that Clarendon always kept for experimental uses, and patted Dick on the head, either to forgive him for having fooled her and Dalton, or to console him for having been fooled himself. As they turned slowly toward the house, Dalton mentioned his resolve to speak to Alfred that evening about their engagement, and Georgina supplied no objection. She knew that her brother would not relish the loss of a faithful manager and companion, but believed his affection would place no barrier in the way of her happiness. Later that evening, Clarendon came into the house with a springy step, an aspect less grim than usual. Dalton, seeing a good omen in this easy buoyancy, took heart as the doctor wrung his hand with a jovial, "Ah, Jimmy, how's politics this year?" He glanced at Georgina, and she quietly excused herself, while the two men settled down to a chat on general subjects. Little by little, amidst many reminders of their old youthful days, Dalton worked toward his point, till at last he came out plainly with the crucial query.
Alf, I want to marry Georgina. Have we your blessing?
Keenly watching his old friend, Dalton saw a shadow steal over his face. The dark eyes flashed for a moment, then veiled themselves as wonted placidity returned. So science or selfishness was at work after all. You're asking an impossibility, James. Georgina isn't the aimless butterfly she was years ago. She has a place in the service of truth and mankind now, and that place is here. She's decided to devote her life to my work, to the household that makes my work possible, and there's no room for desertion or personal caprice. Dalton waited to see if he had finished. The same old fanaticism, humanity versus the individual, and the doctor was going to let it spoil his sister's life. Then he tried to answer.
But look here, Alf. Do you mean to say that Georgina, in particular, is so necessary to your work that you must make a servant and martyr of her? Use your sense of proportion, man. If it were a question of Surama or somebody in the utter thick of your experiments, it might be different. But after all, Georgina is only a housekeeper to you in the last analysis. She has promised to be my wife and says that she loves me. Have you the right to cut her off from the life that belongs to her? Have you the right—
That'll do, James. Clarendon's face was set and white. Whether or not I have the right to govern my own family is no business of an outsider.
Outsider? You can say that to a man who—
Dalton almost choked as the steely voice of the doctor interrupted him again. An outsider to my family, and from now on, an outsider to my home. Dalton, your presumption goes just a little too far. Good evening, Governor. And Clarendon strode from the room without extending his hand. Dalton hesitated for a moment, almost at a loss what to do, when presently Georgina entered. Her face showed that she had spoken with her brother, and Dalton took both her hands impetuously.
Well, Georgie, what do you say? I'm afraid it's a choice between Alf and me. You know how I feel. You know how I felt before, when it was your father I was up against. What's your answer this time?
He paused as she responded slowly.
James, dear, do you believe that I love you?
He nodded and pressed her hands expectantly.
Then, if you love me, you'll wait a while. Don't think of Al's rudeness. He's to be pitied. I can't tell you the whole thing now, but you know how worried I am. What with the strain of his work, the criticisms, and the staring and cackling of that horrible man Surama. I'm afraid he'll break down. He shows the strain more than anyone outside the family could tell. I can see it, for I've watched him all my life. He's changing, slowly bending under his burdens, and he puts on his extra brusqueness to hide it. You can see what I mean, can't you, dear?
She paused and Dalton nodded again, pressing one of her hands to his breast. Then she concluded.
So promise me, dear, to be patient. I must stand by him. I must.
Dalton did not speak for a while, but his head inclined in what was almost a bow of reverence. There was more of Christ in this devoted woman than he had thought any human being possessed, and in the face of such love and loyalty, he could do no urging. Words of sadness and parting were brief, and James, whose blue eyes were misty, scarcely saw the gaunt clinic man as the gate to the street was at last opened to him. But when it slammed to behind him, he heard that blood-curdling chuckle he had come to recognize so well, and knew that Surama was there. Surama, whom Georgina had called her brother's evil genius. Walking away with a firm step, Dalton resolved to be watchful and to act at the first sign of trouble. Chapter 3. Meanwhile, San Francisco, the epidemic still on the lips of all, seethed with anti-Clarendon feeling. Actually, the cases outside the penitentiary were very few and confined almost wholly to the lower element whose lack of sanitation was a standing invitation to disease of every kind. But politicians and the people needed no more than this to confirm the attacks made by the doctor's enemies. Seeing that Dalton was immovable in his championship of Clarendon, the malcontents, medical dogmatists, and ward healers turned their attention to the state legislature. lining up the anti-Clarendonists and the governor's old enemies with great shrewdness, and preparing to launch a law with a veto-proof majority, transferring the authority for minor institutional appointments from the chief executive to the various boards or commissions concerned. In the furtherance of this measure, no lobbyist was more active than Clarendon's chief assistant, Dr. Jones. Jealous of his superior from the first, he now saw an opportunity for turning matters to his liking, and he thanked fate for the circumstance, responsible indeed for his present position, of his relationship to the chairman of the prison board. The new law, if passed, would certainly mean the removal of Clarendon and the appointment of himself in his stead. So, mindful of his own interest, he worked hard for it. Jones was all that Clarendon was not, a natural politician and sycophantic opportunist who served his own advancement first and science only incidentally. He was poor and avid for salaried position, quite in contrast to the wealthy and independent savant he sought to displace. So with a rat-like cunning and persistence, he laboured to undermine the great biologist above him, and was one day rewarded by the news that the new law was passed. Thenceforward the governor was powerless to make appointments to the state institutions, and the medical directorship of San Quentin lay at the disposal of the prison board. Of all this legislative turmoil, Clarendon was singularly oblivious. Wrapped wholly in matters of administration and research, he was blind to the treason of that ass Jones who worked by his side, and deaf to all the gossip of the warden's office. He had never in his life read the newspapers, and the banishment of Dalton from his house cut off his last real link with the world of outside events. With the naivete of a recluse, he at no time thought of his position as insecure. In view of Dalton's loyalty, and of his forgiveness of even the greatest wrongs, as shown in his dealings with the elder Clarendon, who had crushed his father to death on the stock exchange, the possibility of a gubernatorial dismissal was, of course, out of the question. Nor could the doctor's political ignorance envisage a sudden shift of power which might place the matter of retention or dismissal in very different hands. Thereupon he merely smiled with satisfaction when Dalton left for Sacramento, convinced that his place in San Quentin and his sister's place in his household were alike secure from disturbance. He was accustomed to having what he wanted, and fancied his luck was still holding out. The first week in March, a day or so after the enactment of the new law, the chairman of the prison board called at San Quentin. Clarendon was out, but Dr. Jones was glad to show the august visitor, his own uncle incidentally, through the great infirmary, including the fever ward made so famous by press and panic. By this time converted against his will to Clarendon's belief in the fever's non-contagiousness, Jones smilingly assured his uncle that nothing was to be feared, and encouraged him to inspect the patients in detail, especially a ghastly skeleton, once a very giant of bulk and vigour, who was, he insinuated, slowly and painfully dying because Clarendon would not administer the proper medicine.
"Do you mean to say,"
cried the chairman,
"that Dr. Clarendon refuses to let the man have what he needs, knowing his life could be saved?"
Just that,
snapped Dr. Jones, pausing as the door opened to admit none other than Clarendon himself. Clarendon nodded coldly to Jones and surveyed the visitor, whom he did not know, with disapproval. "Dr. Jones, I thought you knew this case was not to be disturbed at all. And haven't I said that visitors aren't to be admitted except by special permission?" But the chairman interrupted before his nephew could introduce him.
"Pardon me, Dr. Clarendon, but am I to understand that you refuse to give this man the medicine that would save him?"
Clarendon glared coldly and rejoined with steel in his voice. "That's an impertinent question, sir. I am in authority here, and visitors are not allowed. Please leave the room at once." The chairman, his sense of drama secretly tickled, answered with greater pomp and hauteur than were necessary.
"You mistake me, sir. I, not you, am master here. You are addressing the chairman of the prison board. I must say, moreover, that I deem your activity a menace to the welfare of the prisoners, and must request your resignation. Henceforth, Dr. Jones will be in charge, and if you wish to remain until your formal dismissal, you will take your orders from him.
It was Wilfred Jones's great moment. Life never gave him another such climax, and we need not grudge him this one. After all, he was a small rather than a bad man, and he had only obeyed a small man's code of looking to himself at all costs. Clarendon stood still, gazing at the speaker as if he thought him mad, till in another second the look of triumph on Dr. Jones's face convinced him that something important was indeed afoot. He was icily courteous as he replied, "No doubt you are what you claim to be, sir. But fortunately, my appointment came from the governor of the state and can therefore be revoked only by him." The chairman and his nephew both stared perplexedly, for they had not realized to what lengths unworldly ignorance can go. Then the older man, grasping the situation, explained at some length.
Had I found that the current reports did you an injustice, I would have deferred action, but the case of this poor man and your own arrogant manner left me no choice. As it is...
But Dr. Clarendon interrupted with a new razor sharpness in his voice. "As it is, I am the director in charge at present, and I ask you to leave this room at once." The chairman reddened and exploded.
Look here, sir. Who do you think you're talking to? I'll have you chucked out of here. Damn your impertinence.
But he had time only to finish the sentence. Transformed by the insult to a sudden dynamo of hate, the slender scientist launched out with both fists in a burst of preternatural strength, of which no one would have thought him capable. And if his strength was preternatural, his accuracy of aim was no less so, for not even a champion of the ring could have wrought a neater result. Both men, the chairman and Dr. Jones, were squarely hit, the one full in the face and the other on the point of the chin. Going down like felled trees, they lay motionless and unconscious on the floor, while Clarendon, now clear and completely master of himself, took his hat and cane and went out to join Surama in the launch. Only when seated in the moving boat did he at last give audible vent to the frightful rage that consumed him. Then, with face convulsed, he called down imprecations from the stars and the gulfs beyond the stars, so that even Surama shuddered, made an elder sign that no book of history records, and forgot to chuckle. Chapter 4. Georgina soothed her brother's hurt as best she could. He had come home mentally and physically exhausted and thrown himself on the library lounge, and in that gloomy room, little by little, the faithful sister had taken in the almost incredible news. Her consolations were instantaneous and tender, and she made him realize how vast, though unconscious, a tribute to his greatness the attacks, persecution, and dismissal all were. He had tried to cultivate the indifference she preached, and could have done so had personal dignity alone been involved. But the loss of scientific opportunity was more than he could calmly bear, and he sighed again and again, as he repeated how 3 months more of study in the prison might have given him at last the long-sought bacillus, which would make all fever a thing of the past. Then Georgina tried another mode of cheering, and told him that surely the prison board would send for him again if the fever did not abate, or if it broke out with increased force. But even this was ineffective, and Clarendon answered only in a string of bitter, ironic, and half-meaningless little sentences, whose tone showed all too clearly how deeply despair and resentment had bitten. Abate? Break out again? Oh, it'll abate all right. At least they'll think it has abated. They'd think anything, no matter what happens. Ignorant eyes see nothing, and bunglers are never discoverers. Science never shows her face to that sort. And they call themselves doctors. Best of all, fancy that ass Jones in charge. Ceasing with a quick sneer, he laughed so demoniacally that Georgina shivered. The days that followed were dismal ones indeed at the Clarendon mansion. Depression, stark and unrelieved, had taken hold of the doctor's usually tireless mind, and he would even have refused food had not Georgina forced it upon him. His great notebook of observations lay unopened on the library table, and his little gold syringe of anti-fever serum, a clever device of his own, with a self-contained reservoir attached to a broad gold finger ring and single-pressure action peculiar to itself, rested idly in a small leather case beside it. Vigour, ambition, and the desire for study and observation seemed to have died within him, and he made no inquiries about his clinic, where hundreds of germ cultures stood in their orderly files awaiting his attention. The countless animals held for experiments played, lively and well-fed, in the early spring sunshine, and as Georgina strolled out through the rose arbour to the cages, she felt a strangely incongruous sense of happiness about her. She knew, though, how tragically transient that happiness must be, since the start of new work would soon make all these small creatures unwilling martyrs to science. Knowing this, she glimpsed a sort of compensating element in her brother's inaction, and encouraged him to keep on in a rest he needed so badly. The 8 Thibetan servants moved noiselessly about, each as impeccably effective as usual, and Georgina saw to it that the order of the household did not suffer because of the master's relaxation. Study and starward ambition laid aside in slippered and dressing-gowned indifference, Clarendon was content to let Georgina treat him as an infant. He met her maternal fussiness with a slow, sad smile and always obeyed her multitude of orders and precepts. A kind of faint, wistful felicity came over the languid household, amidst which the only dissenting note was supplied by Surama. He indeed was miserable, and looked often with sullen and resentful eyes at the sunny serenity in Georgina's face. His only joy had been the turmoil of experiment, and he missed the routine of seizing the fated animals, bearing them to the clinic in clutching talons, and watching them with hot, brooding gaze and evil chuckles as they gradually fell into the final coma with wide-opened, red-rimmed eyes and swollen tongue lolling from froth-covered mouth. Now he was seemingly driven to desperation by the sight of the carefree creatures in their cages, and frequently came to ask Clarendon if there were any orders. Finding the doctor apathetic and unwilling to begin work, he would go away muttering under his breath and glaring curses upon everything, stealing with cat-like tread to his own quarters in the basement, where his voice would sometimes ascend in deep, muffled rhythms of blasphemous strangeness and uncomfortably ritualistic suggestion. All this wore on Georgina's nerves, but not by any means so gravely as her brother's continued lassitude itself. The duration of the state alarmed her, and little by little she lost the air of cheerfulness which had so provoked the clinic man. Herself skilled in medicine, she found the doctor's condition highly unsatisfactory from an alienist's point of view, and she now feared as much from his absence of interest and activity as she had formerly feared from his fanatical zeal and overstudy. Was lingering melancholy about to turn the once brilliant man of intellect into an innocuous imbecile? Then, toward the end of May, came the sudden change. Georgina always recalled the smallest details connected with it, details as trivial as the box delivered to Surama the day before, postmarked Algiers, and emitting a most unpleasant odour, and the sharp sudden thunderstorm, rare in the extreme for California, which sprang up that night as Surama chanted his rituals behind his locked basement door in a droning chest voice louder and more intense than usual. It was a sunny day, and she had been in the garden gathering flowers for the dining room. Re-entering the house, she glimpsed her brother in the library, fully dressed and seated at the table, alternately consulting the notes in his thick observation book and making fresh entries with brisk, assured strokes of the pen. He was alert and vital, and there was a satisfying resilience about his movements as he now and then turned a page or reached for a book from the rear of the great table. Delighted and relieved, Georgina hastened to deposit her flowers in the dining room and return. But when she reached the library again, she found that her brother was gone. She knew, of course, that he must be in the clinic at work, and rejoiced to think that his old mind and purpose had snapped back into place. Realizing it would be of no use to delay the luncheon for him, she ate alone and set aside a bite to be kept warm in case of his return at an odd moment. But he did not come. He was making up for lost time, and was still in the great stout-planked clinic when she went for a stroll through the rose arbour. As she walked among the fragrant blossoms, she saw Surama fetching animals for the test. She wished she could notice him less, for he always made her shudder, but her very dread had sharpened her eyes and ears where he was concerned. He always went hatless around the yard, and the total hairlessness of his head enhanced his skeleton-like aspect horribly. Now she heard a faint chuckle as he took a small monkey from its cage against the wall and carried it to the clinic, his long bony fingers pressing so cruelly into its furry sides that it cried out in frightened anguish. The sight sickened her and brought her walk to an end. Her inmost soul rebelled at the ascendancy this man had gained over her brother, and she reflected bitterly that the two had almost changed places as master and servant. Night came without Clarendon's return to the house, and Georgina concluded that he was absorbed in one of his very longest sessions, which meant total disregard of time. She hated to retire without a talk with him about his sudden recovery, but finally, feeling it would be futile to wait up, she wrote a cheerful note and propped it before his chair on the library table, then started resolutely for bed. She was not quite asleep when she heard the outer door open and shut, so it had not been an all-night session after all. Determined to see that her brother had a meal before retiring, she rose, slipped on a robe, and descended to the library, halting only when she heard voices from behind the half-opened door. Clarendon and Surama were talking, and she waited till the clinic man might go. Surama, however, showed no inclination to depart, and indeed the whole heated tenor of the discourse seemed to bespeak absorption and promise length. Georgina, though she had not meant to listen, could not help catching a phrase now and then, and presently became aware of a sinister undercurrent which frightened her very much without being wholly clear to her. Her brother's voice, nervous, incisive, held her notice with disquieting persistence. "But anyway," he was saying, "we haven't enough animals for another day, and you know how hard it is to get a decent supply at short notice. It seems silly to waste so much effort on comparative trash when human specimens could be had with just a little extra care." Georgina sickened at the possible implication and caught at the hall rack to steady herself. Surama was replying in that deep, hollow tone which seemed to echo with the evil of 1,000 ages and 1,000 planets.
Steady, steady. What a child you are with your haste and impatience. You crowd things so. When you've lived as I have, so that a whole life will seem only an hour, you won't be so fretful about a day or week or month. You work too fast. You've plenty of specimens in the cages for a full week if you'll only go at a sensible rate. You might even begin on the older material if you'd be sure not to overdo it.
"Never mind my haste," the reply was snapped out sharply. "I have my own methods. I don't want to use our material if I can help it, for I prefer them as they are. And you'd better be careful of them anyway. You know the knives those sly dogs carry." Surama's deep chuckle came.
Don't worry about that. The brutes eat, don't they? Well, I can get you one any time you need it, but go slow. With the boy gone, there are only 8. And now that you've lost San Quentin, it'll be hard to get new ones by the wholesale. I'd advise you to start in on Sampo. He's the least used to you as he is, and...
But that was all Georgina heard. Transfixed by a hideous dread from the thoughts this talk excited, she nearly sank to the floor where she stood, and was scarcely able to drag herself up the stairs and into her room. What was the evil monster Surama planning? Into what was he guiding her brother? What monstrous circumstances lay behind these cryptic sentences? 1,000 phantoms of darkness and menace danced before her eyes, and she flung herself upon the bed without hope of sleep. One thought above the rest stood out with fiendish prominence, and she almost screamed aloud as it beat itself into her brain with renewed force. Then nature, kinder than she expected, intervened at last. Closing her eyes in a dead faint, she did not awake till morning, nor did any fresh nightmare come to join the lasting one which the overheard words had brought. With the morning sunshine came a lessening of the tension. What happens in the night when one is tired often reaches the consciousness in distorted forms, and Georgina could see that her brain must have given strange colour to scraps of common medical conversation. To suppose her brother, only son of the gentle Francis Schuyler Clarendon, guilty of savage sacrifices in the name of science, would be to do an injustice to their blood. And she decided to omit all mention of her trip downstairs, lest Alfred ridicule her fantastic notions. When she reached the breakfast table, she found that Clarendon was already gone, and regretted that not even this second morning had given her a chance to congratulate him on his revived activity. Quietly taking the breakfast served by stone-deaf old Margarita, the Mexican cook, she read the morning paper and seated herself with some needlework by the sitting-room window overlooking the great yard. All was silent out there, and she could see that the last of the animal cages had been emptied. Science was served, and the lime pit held all that was left of the once pretty and lively little creatures. This slaughter had always grieved her, but she had never complained, since she knew it was all for humanity. Being a scientist's sister, she used to say to herself, was like being the sister of a soldier who kills to save his countrymen from their foes. After luncheon, Georgina resumed her post by the window and had been busily sewing for some time when the sound of a pistol shot from the yard caused her to look out in alarm. There, not far from the clinic, she saw the ghastly form of Surama, a revolver in his hand, and his skull face twisted into a strange expression as he chuckled at a cowering figure robed in black silk and carrying a long Tibetan knife. It was the servant Sanpo, and as she recognized the shriveled face, Georgina remembered horribly what she had overheard the night before. The sun flashed on the polished blade, and suddenly Surama's revolver spat once more. This time the knife flew from the man's hand, and Surama glanced greedily at his shaking and bewildered prey. Then Sanpo, glancing quickly at his unhurt hand and at the fallen knife, sprang nimbly away from the stealthily approaching clinic man and made a dash for the house. Surama, however, was too swift for him and caught him in a single leap, seizing his shoulder and almost crushing him. For a moment the Tibetan tried to struggle, but Surama lifted him like an animal by the scruff of the neck and bore him off toward the clinic. Georgina heard him chuckling and taunting the man in his own tongue and saw the face of the victim twist and quiver with fright. Suddenly realizing against her own will what was taking place, a great horror mastered her, and she fainted for the second time within 24 hours. When consciousness returned, the golden light of late afternoon was flooding the room. Georgina, picking up her fallen work basket and scattered materials, was lost in a daze of doubt, but finally felt convinced that the scene which had overcome her must have been all too tragically real. Her worst fears, then, were horrible truths. What to do about it? Nothing in her experience could tell her, and she was vaguely thankful that her brother did not appear. She must talk to him, but not now. She could not talk to anybody now, and thinking shudderingly of the monstrous happening behind those barred clinic windows, she crept into bed for a long night of anguished sleeplessness. Rising haggardly on the following day, Georgina saw the doctor for the first time since his recovery. He was bustling about preoccupiedly, circulating between the house and the clinic, and paying little attention to anything besides his work. There was no chance for the dreaded interview, and Clarendon did not even notice his sister's worn-out aspect and hesitant manner. In the evening she heard him in the library, talking to himself in a fashion most unusual for him, and she felt that he was under a great strain which might culminate in the return of his apathy. Entering the room, she tried to calm him without referring to any trying subject, and forced a steadying cup of bouillon upon him. Finally, she asked gently what was distressing him, and waited anxiously for his reply, hoping to hear that Surama's treatment of the poor Tibetan had horrified and outraged him. There was a note of fretfulness in his voice as he responded, What's distressing me? Good God, Georgina, what isn't? Look at the cages and see if you have to ask again. Cleaned out, milked dry, not a cursed specimen left, and a line of the most important bacterial cultures incubating in their tubes without a chance to do an ounce of good. Days' work wasted. Whole program set back. It's enough to drive a man mad. How shall I ever get anywhere if I can't scrape up some decent subjects? Georgina stroked his forehead.
I think you ought to rest a while, Al dear.
He moved away. Rest. That's good. That's damn good. What else have I been doing but resting and vegetating and staring blankly into space for the last 50 or 100 or 1,000 years? Just as I manage to shake off the clouds, I have to run short of material, and then I'm told to lapse back again into drooling stupefaction. God! And all the while, some sneaking thief is probably working with my data and getting ready to come out ahead of me with the credit for my own work. I'll lose by a neck. Some fool with the proper specimens will get the prize when 1 week more with even half-adequate facilities would see me through with flying colours. His voice rose querulously, and there was an overtone of mental strain which Georgina did not like. She answered softly, yet not so softly as to hint at the soothing of a psychopathic case.
But you're killing yourself with this worry and tension, and if you're dead, how can you do your work?
He gave a smile that was almost a sneer. I guess a week or a month, all the time I need, wouldn't quite finish me, and it doesn't much matter what becomes of me or any other individual in the end. Science is what must be served. Science, the austere cause of human knowledge. I'm like the monkeys and birds and guinea pigs I use, just a cog in the machine to be used to the advantage of the whole. They had to be killed. I may have to be killed. What of it? Isn't the cause we serve worth that and more? Georgina sighed. For a moment she wondered whether, after all, this ceaseless round of slaughter really was worthwhile.
But are you absolutely sure your discovery will be enough of a boon to humanity to warrant these sacrifices?
Clarendon's eyes flashed dangerously. Humanity! What the deuce is humanity? Science, dolts, just individuals over and over again. Humanity is made for preachers to whom it means the blindly credulous. Humanity is made for the predatory rich to whom it speaks in terms of dollars and cents. Humanity is made for the politician to whom it signifies collective power to be used to his advantage. What is humanity? Nothing. Thank God that crude illusion doesn't last. What a grown man worships is truth, knowledge, science, light, the rending of the veil and the pushing back of the shadow. Knowledge the juggernaut. There is death in our own ritual. We must kill, dissect, destroy, and all for the sake of discovery, the worship of the ineffable light. The goddess science demands it. We test a doubtful poison by killing. How else? No thought for self, just knowledge. The effect must be known. His voice trailed off in a kind of temporary exhaustion, and Georgina shuddered slightly.
But this is horrible, Al. You shouldn't think of it that way.
Clarendon cackled sardonically, in a manner which stirred odd and repugnant associations in his sister's mind. Horrible? You think what I say is horrible? You ought to hear Surama. I tell you, things were known to the priests of Atlantis that would have you drop dead of fright if you heard a hint of them. Knowledge was knowledge 100,000 years ago, when our especial forebears were shambling about Asia as speechless semi-apes. They know something of it in the Hogar region. There are rumours in the farther uplands of Tibet, and once I heard an old man in China calling on Yog-Sothoth. He turned pale and made a curious sign in the air with his extended forefinger. Georgina felt genuinely alarmed, but became somewhat calmer as his speech took a less fantastic form. Yes, it may be horrible, but it's glorious too. The pursuit of knowledge, I mean. Certainly there's no slovenly sentiment connected with it. Doesn't nature kill, constantly and remorselessly, and are any but fools horrified at the struggle? Killings are necessary, they are the glory of science. We learn something from them, and we can't sacrifice learning to sentiment. Hear the sentimentalists howl against vaccination. They fear it will kill the child. Well, what if it does? How else can we discover the laws of disease concerned? As a scientist's sister, you ought to know better than to prate sentiment. You ought to help my work instead of hindering it.
But Al, I haven't the slightest intention of hindering your work. Haven't I always tried to help as much as I could? I am ignorant, I suppose, and can't help very actively. But at least I'm proud of you. Proud for my own sake and for the family's sake. And I've always tried to smooth the way. You've given me credit for that many a time.
Clarendon looked at her keenly. Yes, he said jerkily as he rose and strode from the room. You're right. You've always tried to help as best you knew. You may yet have a chance to help still more. Georgina, seeing him disappear through the front door, followed him into the yard. Some distance away, a lantern was shining through the trees, and as they approached it, they saw Surama bending over a large object stretched on the ground. Clarendon, advancing, gave a short grunt, but when Georgina saw what it was, she rushed up with a shriek. It was Dick, the great St. Bernard, and he was lying still with reddened eyes and protruding tongue.
He's sick, Al. Do something for him, quick.
The doctor looked at Surama, who had uttered something in a tongue unknown to Georgina. Take him to the clinic, he ordered. I'm afraid Dick's caught the fever. Surama took up the dog as he had taken poor Tsanpo the day before and carried him silently to the building near the wall. He did not chuckle this time, but glanced at Clarendon with what appeared to be real anxiety. It almost seemed to Georgina that Surama was asking the doctor to save her pet. Clarendon, however, made no move to follow, but stood still for a moment and then sauntered slowly toward the house. Georgina, astonished at such callousness, kept up a running fire of entreaties on Dick's behalf, but it was of no use. Without paying the slightest attention to her pleas, he made directly for the library and began to read in a large old book which had lain face down on the table. She put her hand on his shoulder as he sat there, but he did not speak or turn his head. He only kept on reading, and Georgina, glancing curiously over his shoulder, wondered in what strange alphabet this brass-bound tome was written. In the cavernous parlour across the hall, sitting alone in the dark a quarter of an hour later, Georgina came to her decision. Something was gravely wrong. Just what, and to what extent, she scarcely dared formulate to herself, and it was time that she called in some stronger force to help her. Of course it must be James. He was powerful and capable, and his sympathy and affection would show him the right thing to do. He had known Al always, and would understand. It was by this time rather late, but Georgina had resolved on action. Across the hall the light still shone from the library, and she looked wistfully at the doorway as she quietly donned a hat and left the house. Outside the gloomy mansion and forbidding grounds, it was only a short walk to Jackson Street, where by good luck she found a carriage to take her to the Western Union Telegraph Office. There she carefully wrote out a message to James Dalton in Sacramento, asking him to come at once to San Francisco on a matter of the greatest importance to them all. Chapter 5. Dalton was frankly perplexed by Georgina's sudden message. He had had no word from the Clarendons since that stormy February evening when Alfred had declared him an outsider to his home. And he, in turn, had studiously refrained from communicating, even when he had longed to express sympathy after the doctor's summary ousting from office. He had fought hard to frustrate the politicians and keep the appointive power, and was bitterly sorry to watch the unseating of a man who, despite recent estrangements, still represented to him the ultimate ideal of scientific competence. Now, with this clearly frightened summons before him, he could not imagine what had happened. He knew, though, that Georgina was not one to lose her head or send forth a needless alarm, hence he wasted no time, but took the overland which left Sacramento within the hour, going at once to his club and sending word to Georgina by a messenger that he was in town and wholly at her service. Meanwhile, things had been quiescent at the Clarendon home. notwithstanding the doctor's continued taciturnity and his absolute refusal to report on the dog's condition. Shadows of evil seemed omnipresent and thickening, but for the moment there was a lull. Georgina was relieved to get Dalton's message and learn that he was close at hand, and sent back word that she would call him when necessity arose. Amidst all the gathering tension, some faint compensating element seemed manifest, and Georgina finally decided that it was the absence of the lean Tibetans, whose stealthy, sinuous ways and disturbing exotic aspect had always annoyed her. They had vanished all at once, and old Margarita, the sole visible servant left in the house, told her they were helping their master and Surama at the clinic. The following morning, the 28th of May, long to be remembered, was dark and lowering, and Georgina felt the precarious calm wearing thin. She did not see her brother at all, but knew he was in the clinic hard at work at something despite the lack of specimens he had bewailed. She wondered how poor Sampo was getting along, and whether he had really been subjected to any serious inoculation. But it must be confessed that she wondered more about Dick. She longed to know whether Surama had done anything for the faithful dog amidst his master's oddly callous indifference. Surama's apparent solicitude on the night of Dick's seizure had impressed her greatly, giving her perhaps the kindliest feeling she had ever had for the detested clinic man. Now, as the day advanced, she found herself thinking more and more of Dick, till at last her harassed nerves, finding in this one detail a sort of symbolic summation of the whole horror that lay upon the household, could stand the suspense no longer. Up to that time she had always respected Alfred's imperious wish that he be never approached or disturbed at the clinic. But as this fateful afternoon advanced, her resolution to break through the barrier grew stronger and stronger. Finally, she set out with determined face, crossing the yard and entering the unlocked vestibule of the forbidden structure with the fixed intention of discovering how the dog was, or of knowing the reason for her brother's secrecy. The inner door, as usual, was locked, and behind it she heard voices in heated conversation. When her knocking brought no response, she rattled the knob as loudly as possible, but still the voices argued on unheeding. They belonged, of course, to Surama and her brother. And as she stood there trying to attract attention, she could not help catch something of their drift. Fate had made her for the second time an eavesdropper, and once more the matter she overheard seemed likely to tax her mental poise and nervous endurance to their ultimate bounds. Alfred and Surama were plainly quarrelling with increasing violence, and the purport of their speech was enough to arouse the wildest fears and confirm the gravest apprehensions. Georgina shivered as her brother's voice mounted shrilly to dangerous heights of fanatical tension. "You, damn you! You're a fine one to talk defeat and moderation to me. Who started all this anyway? Did I have any idea of your cursed devil gods and elder world? Did I ever in my life think of your damned spaces beyond the stars and your crawling chaos Nyarlathotep? I was a normal scientific man, confound you, till I was fool enough to drag you out of the vaults with your devilish Atlantean secrets. You egged me on, and now you want to cut me off. You loaf around doing nothing and telling me to go slow when you might just as well as not be going out and getting material. You know damn well that I don't know how to go about such things, whereas you must have been an old hand at it before the earth was made. It's like you damned walking corpse, to start something you won't or can't finish." Surama's evil chuckle came.
"You're insane, Clarendon. That's the only reason I let you rave on when I could send you to hell in 3 minutes. Enough is enough, and you've certainly had enough material for any novice at your stage. You've had all I'm going to get you anyhow. You're only a maniac on the subject now. What a cheap, crazy thing to sacrifice even your poor sister's pet dog when you could have spared him as well as not. You can't look at any living thing now without wanting to jab that gold syringe into it. No, Dick had to go where the boy went, where Tsanpo and the other 7 went, where all the animals went. What a pupil. You're no fun anymore. You've lost your nerve. You set out to control things, and they're controlling you. I'm about done with you, Clarendon. I thought you had the stuff in you, but you haven't. It's about time I tried somebody else. I'm afraid you'll have to go."
In the doctor's shouted reply, there was both fear and frenzy. "Be careful, you. There are powers against your powers. I didn't go to China for nothing, and there are things in Alhazred's Azif which weren't known in Atlantis. We've both meddled in dangerous things, but you needn't think you know all my resources. How about the nemesis of flame? I talked in Yemen with an old man who had come back alive from the Crimson Desert. He had seen Irem, the city of pillars, and had worshipped at the underground shrines of Nug and Yeb, Shub-Nigrath. Through Clarendon's shrieking falsetto cut the deep chuckle of the clinic man.
"Shut up, you fool. Do you suppose your grotesque nonsense has any weight with me? Words and formulae, words and formulae. What do they all mean to one who has the substance behind them? We're in a material sphere now, and subject to material laws. You have your fever, I have my revolver. You'll get no specimens, and I'll get no fever so long as I have you in front of me with this gun between."
That was all Georgina could hear. She felt her senses reeling and staggered out of the vestibule for a saving breath of the lowering outside air. She saw that the crisis had come at last, and that help must now arrive quickly if her brother was to be saved from the unknown gulfs of madness and mystery. Summoning up all her reserve energy, she managed to reach the house and get to the library, where she scrawled a hasty note for Margarita to take to James Dalton. When the old woman had gone, Georgina had just strength enough to cross to the lounge and sink weakly down into a sort of semi-stupor. There she lay for what seemed like years, conscious only of the fantastic creeping up of the twilight from the lower corners of the great, dismal room, and plagued by 1,000 shadowy shapes of terror which filed with phantasmal half-limbed pageantry through her tortured and stifled brain. Dusk deepened into darkness, and still the spell held. Then a firm tread sounded in the hall, and she heard someone enter the room and fumble at the match safe. Her heart almost stopped beating as the gas jets of the chandelier flared up one by one, but then she saw that the arrival was her brother. Relieved to the bottom of her heart that he was still alive, she gave vent to an involuntary sigh, profound, long-drawn and tremulous, and lapsed at last into kindly oblivion. At the sound of that sigh, Clarendon turned in alarm toward the lounge and was inexpressibly shocked to see the pale and unconscious form of his sister there. Her face had a death-like quality that frightened his inmost spirit, and he flung himself on his knees by her side, awake to a realization of what her passing away would mean to him. Long unused to private practice amidst his ceaseless quest for truth, he had lost the physician's instinct of first aid, and could only call out her name and chafe her wrists mechanically as fear and grief possessed him. Then he thought of water, and ran to the dining room for a carafe. Stumbling about in a darkness which seemed to harbour vague terrors, he was some time in finding what he sought, but at last he clutched it in shaking hand and hastened back to dash the cold fluid in Georgina's face. The method was crude but effective. She stirred, sighed a second time, and finally opened her eyes. "You are alive," he cried, and put his cheek to hers as she stroked his head maternally. She was almost glad she fainted, for the circumstance seemed to have dispelled the strange Alfred and brought her own brother back to her. She sat up slowly and tried to reassure him.
"I'm all right, Al. Just give me a glass of water. It's a sin to waste it this way, to say nothing of spoiling my waist. Is that the way to behave every time your sister drops off for a nap? You needn't think I'm going to be sick, for I haven't time for such nonsense."
Alfred's eyes showed that her cool, common-sense speech had had its effect. His brotherly panic dissolved in an instant, and instead there came into his face a vague, calculating expression, as if some marvellous possibility had just dawned upon him. As she watched the subtle waves of cunning and appraisal pass fleetingly over his countenance, she became less and less certain that her mode of reassurance had been a wise one, and before he spoke, she found herself shivering at something she could not define. A keen medical instinct almost told her that his moment of sanity had passed, and that he was now once more the unrestrained fanatic for scientific research. There was something morbid in the quick narrowing of his eyes at her casual mention of good health. What was he thinking? To what unnatural extreme was his passion for experiment about to be pushed? Wherein lay the special significance of her blood and absolutely flawless organic state? None of these misgivings, however, troubled Georgina for more than a second, and she was quite natural and unsuspicious as she felt her brother's steady fingers at her pulse. "You're a bit feverish, Georgie," he said in a precise, elaborately restrained voice as he looked professionally into her eyes.
Why, nonsense, I'm all right. One would think you were on the watch for fever patients just for the sake of showing off your discovery. It would be poetic, though, if you could make your final proof and demonstration by curing your own sister.
Clarendon started violently and guiltily. Had she suspected his wish? Had he muttered anything aloud? He looked at her closely and saw that she had no inkling of the truth. She smiled up sweetly into his face and patted his hand as he stood by the side of the lounge. Then he took a small oblong leather case from his vest pocket, and taking out a little gold syringe, he began fingering it thoughtfully, pushing the piston speculatively in and out of the empty cylinder. "I wonder," he began with suave sententiousness, "whether you would really be willing to help science in something like that way, if the need arose. Whether you would have the devotion to offer yourself to the cause of medicine as a sort of Jephthah's daughter if you knew it meant the absolute perfection and completion of my work." Georgina, catching the odd and unmistakable glitter in her brother's eyes, knew at last that her worst fears were true. There was nothing to do now but keep him quiet at all hazards and to pray that Margarita had found James Dalton at his club.
You look tired, Al, dear. Why not take a little morphia and get some of the sleep you need so badly?
He replied with a kind of crafty deliberation. "Yes, you're right. I'm worn out, and so are you. Each of us needs a good sleep. Morphine is just the thing. Wait till I go and fill the syringe and we'll both take a proper dose." Still fingering the empty syringe, he walked softly out of the room. Georgina looked about her with the aimlessness of desperation, ears alert for any sign of possible help. She thought she heard Margarita again in the basement kitchen and rose to ring the bell in an effort to learn of the fate of her message. The old servant answered her summons at once and declared she had given the message at the club hours ago. Governor Dalton had been out, but the clerk had promised to deliver the note at the very moment of his arrival. Margarita waddled below stairs again, but still Clarendon did not reappear. What was he doing? What was he planning? She had heard the outer door slam, so knew he must be at the clinic. Had he forgotten his original intention with the vacillating mind of madness? The suspense grew almost unbearable, and Georgina had to keep her teeth clenched tightly to avoid screaming. It was the gate bell, which rang simultaneously in house and clinic, that broke the tension at last. She heard the cat-like tread of Sarama on the walk as he left the clinic to answer it, and then, with an almost hysterical sigh of relief, she caught the firm, familiar accents of Dalton in conversation with the sinister attendant. Rising, she almost tottered to meet him as he loomed up in the library doorway, and for a moment no word was spoken while he kissed her hand in his courtly, old-school fashion. Then Georgina burst forth into a torrent of hurried explanation, telling all that had happened, all she had glimpsed and overheard, and all she feared and suspected. Dalton listened gravely and comprehendingly, his first bewilderment gradually giving place to astonishment, sympathy, and resolution. The message, held by a careless clerk, had been slightly delayed, and had found him appropriately enough in the midst of a warm lounging room discussion about Clarendon. A fellow member, Dr. McNeil, had brought in a medical journal with an article well calculated to disturb the devoted scientist, and Dalton had just asked to keep the paper for future reference when the message was handed him at last. Abandoning his half-formed plan to take Dr. McNeil into his confidence regarding Alfred, he called at once for his hat and stick, and lost not a moment in getting a cab for the Clarendon home. Surama, he thought, appeared alarmed at recognizing him, though he had chuckled as usual when striding off again toward the clinic. Dalton always recalled Surama's stride and chuckle on this ominous night, for he was never to see the unearthly creature again. As the chuckler entered the clinic vestibule, his deep guttural gurgles seemed to blend with some low mutterings of thunder which troubled the far horizon. When Dalton had heard all Georgina had to say and learned that Alfred was expected back at any moment with an hypodermic dose of morphine, he decided he had better talk with the doctor alone. Advising Georgina to retire to her room and await developments, he walked about the gloomy library, scanning the shelves and listening for Clarendon's nervous footstep on the clinic path outside. The vast room's corners were dismal despite the chandelier, and the closer Dalton looked at his friend's choice of books, the less he liked them. It was not the balanced collection of a normal physician, biologist, or man of general culture. There were too many volumes on doubtful borderland themes, dark speculations and forbidden rituals of the Middle Ages, and strange exotic mysteries in alien alphabets, both known and unknown. The great notebook of observations on the table was unwholesome too. The handwriting had a neurotic cast, and the spirit of the entries was far from reassuring. Long passages were inscribed in crabbed Greek characters, and as Dalton marshalled his linguistic memory for their translation, he gave a sudden start, and wished his college struggles with Xenophon and Homer had been more conscientious. There was something wrong, something hideously wrong here, and the governor sank limply into the chair by the table as he pored more and more closely over the doctor's barbarous Greek. Then a sound came, startlingly near, and he jumped nervously at a hand laid sharply on his shoulder. "What, may I ask, is the cause of this intrusion? You might have stated your business to Surama." Clarendon was standing icily by the chair, the little gold syringe in one hand. He seemed very calm and rational, and Dalton fancied for a moment that Georgina must have exaggerated his condition. How, too, could a rusty scholar be absolutely sure about these Greek entries? The governor decided to be very cautious in his interview, and thanked the lucky chance which had placed a specious pretext in his coat pocket. He was very cool and assured as he rose to reply.
"I didn't think you'd care to have things dragged before a subordinate, but I thought you ought to see this article at once."
He drew forth the magazine given him by Dr. McNeil and handed it to Clarendon.
On page 542, you see the heading, "Black Fever Conquered by New Serum." It's by Dr. Miller of Philadelphia, and he thinks he's got ahead of you with your cure. They were discussing it at the club, and McNeil thought the exposition very convincing. I, as a layman, couldn't pretend to judge, but at all events I thought you oughtn't to miss a chance to digest the thing while it's fresh. If you're busy, of course, I won't disturb you.
Clarendon cut in sharply. "I'm going to give my sister an hypodermic. She's not quite well, but I'll look at what that quack has to say when I get back. I know Miller, a damn sneak and incompetent, and I don't believe he has the brains to steal my methods from the little he's seen of them." Dalton suddenly felt a wave of intuition warning him that Georgina must not receive that intended dose. There was something sinister about it. From what she had said, Alfred must have been inordinately long preparing it, far longer than was needed for the dissolving of a morphine tablet. He decided to hold his host as long as possible, meanwhile testing his attitude in a more or less subtle way.
"I'm sorry Georgina isn't well. Are you sure that the injection will do her good? That it won't do her any harm?"
Clarendon's spasmodic start showed that something had been struck home. "Do her harm," he cried. "Don't be absurd. You know Georgina must be in the best of health. The very best, I say, in order to serve science as a Clarendon should serve it. She at least appreciates the fact that she is my sister. She deems no sacrifice too great in my service. She is a priestess of truth and discovery, as I am a priest." He paused in his shrill tirade, wild-eyed and somewhat out of breath. Dalton could see that his attention had been momentarily shifted. "But let me see what this cursed quack has to say," he continued. "If he thinks his pseudo-medical rhetoric can take a real doctor in, he is even simpler than I thought." Clarendon nervously found the right page and began reading as he stood there clutching his syringe. Dalton wondered what the real facts were. MacNeil had assured him that the author was a pathologist of the highest standing, and that whatever errors the article might have, the mind behind it was powerful, erudite, and absolutely honourable and sincere. Watching the doctor as he read, Dalton saw the thin, bearded face grow pale. The great eyes blazed, and the pages crackled in the tenser grip of the long, lean fingers. A perspiration broke out on the high, ivory-white forehead where the hair was already thinning, and the reader sank gaspingly into the chair his visitor had vacated as he kept on with his devouring of the text. Then came a wild scream as from a haunted beast, and Clarendon lurched forward on the table, his outflung arms sweeping books and paper before them, as consciousness went dark, like a wind-quenched candle flame. Dalton, springing to help his stricken friend, raised the slim form and tilted it back in the chair. Seeing the carafe on the floor near the lounge, he dashed some water into the twisted face and was rewarded by seeing the large eyes slowly open. They were sane eyes now, deep and sad and unmistakably sane, and Dalton felt awed in the presence of a tragedy whose ultimate depth he could never hope or dare to plumb. The golden hypodermic was still clutched in the lean left hand, and as Clarendon drew a deep, shuddering breath, he unclosed his fingers and studied the glittering thing that rolled about on his palm. Then he spoke, slowly and with the ineffable sadness of utter, absolute despair. "Thanks, Jimmy. I'm quite all right. But there's much to be done. You asked me a while back if this shot of morphia would do Georgie any harm. I'm in a position now to tell you that it won't." He turned a small screw in the syringe and laid a finger on the piston, at the same time pulling with his left hand at the skin of his own neck. Dalton cried out in alarm as a lightning motion of his right hand injected the contents of the cylinder into the ridge of distended flesh.
"Good Lord, Al, what have you done?"
Clarendon smiled gently, a smile almost of peace and resignation. Different indeed from the sardonic sneer of the past few weeks. "You ought to know, Jimmy, if you've still the judgment that made you a governor. You must have pieced together enough from my notes to realize that there's nothing else to do. With your marks in Greek back at Columbia, I guess you couldn't have missed much. All I can say is that it's true. James, I don't like to pass blame along, but it's only right to tell you that Sarama got me into this. I can't tell you who or what he is, for I don't fully know myself, and what I do know is stuff that no sane person ought to know. But I will say that I don't consider him a human being in the fullest sense, and that I'm not sure whether or not he's alive as we know life. You think I'm talking nonsense. I wish I were, but the whole hideous mess is damnably real. I started out in life with a clean mind and purpose. I wanted to rid the world of fever. I tried and failed, and I wish to God I'd been honest enough to say that I'd failed. Don't let my old talk of science deceive you, James. I found no antitoxin and was never even half on the track of one. Don't look so shaken up, old fellow. A veteran politician fighter like you must have seen plenty of unmaskings before. I tell you, I never had even the start of a fever cure. But my studies had taken me into some queer places, and it was just my damned luck to listen to the stories of some still queerer people. James, if you ever wish any man well, tell him to keep clear of the ancient hidden places of the earth. Old backwaters are dangerous. Things are handed down there that don't do healthy people any good. I talked too much with old priests and mystics, and got to hoping I might achieve things in dark ways that I couldn't achieve in lawful ways. I shan't tell you just what I mean, for if I did, I'd be as bad as the old priests that were the ruin of me. All I need say is that after what I've learned, I shudder at the thought of the world and what it's been through. The world is cursed old, James, and there have been whole chapters lived and closed before the dawn of our organic life and the geologic eras connected with it. It's an awful thought, whole forgotten cycles of evolution with beings and races and wisdom and diseases, all lived through and gone before the first amoeba ever stirred in the tropic seas geology tells us about. I said gone, but I didn't quite mean that. It would have been better that way, but it wasn't quite so. In places, traditions have kept on, I can't tell you how, and certain archaic life forms have managed to struggle thinly down the eons in hidden spots. There were cults, you know, bands of evil priests in lands now buried under the sea. Atlantis was the hotbed. That was a terrible place. If heaven is merciful, no one will ever drag up that horror from the deep. It had a colony, though, that didn't sink, and when you get too confidential with one of the Tuareg priests in Africa, he's likely to tell you wild tales about it. Tales that connect up with whispers you'll hear among the mad llamas and flighty yak drivers on the secret tablelands of Asia. I'd heard all the common tales and whispers when I came on the big one. What that was, you'll never know. But it pertained to somebody or something that had come down from a blasphemously long time ago, and could be made to live again, or seem alive again, through certain processes that weren't very clear to the man who told me. Now, James, in spite of my confession about the fever, you know I'm not bad as a doctor. I plugged hard at medicine and soaked up about as much as the next man, maybe a little more, because down there in the Hogger country, I did something no priest had ever been able to do. They led me blindfolded to a place that had been sealed up for generations, and I came back with Sarama. Easy, James. I know what you want to say. How does he know all he knows? Why does he speak English, or any other language for that matter, without an accent? Why did he come away with me? And all that. I can't tell you altogether, but I can say that he takes in ideas and images and impressions with something besides his brain and senses. He had a use for me and my science. He told me things and opened up vistas. He taught me to worship ancient, primordial and unholy gods and mapped out a road to a terrible goal which I can't even hint to you. Don't press me, James. It's for the sake of your sanity and the world's sanity. The creature is beyond all bounds. He's in league with the stars and all the forces of nature. Don't think I'm still crazy, James. I swear to you I'm not. I've had too many glimpses to doubt. He gave me new pleasures that were forms of his Paleogean worship. And the greatest of those was the black fever. God, James, haven't you seen through the business by this time? Do you still believe the black fever came out of Tibet and that I learned about it there? Use your brains, man. Look at Miller's article here. He's found a basic antitoxin that will end all fever within half a century, when other men learn how to modify it for the different forms. He's cut the ground of my youth from under me, done what I'd have given my life to do, taken the wind out of all the honest sails I ever flung to the breeze of science. Do you wonder his article gave me a turn? Do you wonder it shocks me out of my madness back to the old dreams of my youth? Too late, but not too late to save others. I guess I'm rambling a bit now, old man. You know, the hypodermic. I asked you why you didn't tumble to the facts about black fever. How could you, though? Doesn't Miller say he's cured 7 cases with his serum? A matter of diagnosis, James. He only thinks it is black fever. I can read between his lines. Here, old chap, on page 551 is the key to the whole thing. Read it again. You see, don't you? The fever cases from the Pacific coast didn't respond to his serum. They puzzled him. They didn't even seem like any true fever he knew. Well, those were my cases. Those were the real black fever cases. And there can't ever be an antitoxin on Earth that'll cure black fever. How do I know? Because black fever isn't of this Earth. It's from somewhere else, James. And Surama alone knows where, because he brought it here. He brought it and I spread it. That's the secret, James. That's all I wanted the appointment for. That's all I ever did. Just spread the fever that I carried in this gold syringe and in the deadlier finger ring pump syringe you see on my index finger. Science? A blind. I wanted to kill and kill and kill. A single pressure on my finger, and the black fever was inoculated. I wanted to see living things writhe and squirm, scream and froth at the mouth. A single pressure of the pump syringe and I could watch them as they died. And I couldn't live or think unless I had plenty to watch. That's why I jabbed everything in sight with the accursed hollow needle. Animals, criminals, children, servants, and the next would have been... Clarendon's voice broke, and he crumpled up perceptibly in his chair. That, James, was my life. Surama made it so. He taught me and kept me at it till I couldn't stop. Then it got too much even for him. He tried to check me. Fancy, he trying to check anybody in that line. But now I've got my last specimen. That is my last test. Good subject, James. I'm healthy. Devilish healthy. Deuced ironic, though. The madness has gone now, so there won't be any fun watching the agony. Can't be. Can't. A violent shiver of fever racked the doctor, and Dalton mourned amidst his horror stupefaction that he could give no grief. How much of Alfred's story was sheer nonsense, and how much nightmare truth he could not say. But in any case, he felt that the man was a victim rather than a criminal. And above all, he was a boyhood comrade and Georgina's brother. Thoughts of the old days came back kaleidoscopically. Little Alf, the yard at Phillips Exeter, the quadrangle at Columbia, the fight with Tom Cortland when he saved Alf from a pommeling. He helped Clarendon to the lounge and asked gently what he could do. There was nothing. Alfred could only whisper now, but he asked forgiveness for all his offences and commended his sister to the care of his friend. You'll make her happy, he gasped. She deserves it. Martyr to a myth. Make it up to her, James. Don't let her know more than she has to. His voice trailed off in a mumble and he fell into a stupor. Dalton rang the bell, but Margarita had gone to bed, so he called up the stairs for Georgina. She was firm of step, but very pale. Alfred's scream had tried her sorely, but she had trusted James. She trusted him still, as he showed her the unconscious form on the lounge and asked her to go back to her room and rest, no matter what sounds she might hear. He did not wish her to witness the awful spectacle of delirium certain to come, but bade her kiss her brother a final farewell as he lay there calm and still, very like the delicate boy he had once been. So she left him, the strange, moonstruck, star-reading genius she had mothered so long, and the picture she carried away was a very merciful one. Dalton must bear to his grave a sterner picture. His fears of delirium were not vain, and all through the black midnight hours, his giant strength restrained the frenzied contortions of the mad sufferer. What he heard from those swollen, blackening lips he will never repeat. He has never been quite the same man since, and he knows that no one who hears such things can ever be wholly as he was before. So, for the world's good, he dares not speak, and he thanks God that his layman's ignorance of certain subjects makes many of the revelations cryptic and meaningless to him. Toward morning, Clarendon suddenly woke to a sane consciousness and began to speak in a firm voice. James, I didn't tell you what must be done, about everything. Blot out these entries in Greek and send my notebook to Dr. Miller. All my other notes too that you'll find in the files. He's the big authority today. His article proves it. Your friend at the club was right. But everything in the clinic must go. Everything without exception, dead or alive or otherwise. All the plagues of hell are in those bottles on the shelves. Burn them. Burn it all. If one thing escapes, Surama will spread black death throughout the world. And above all, burn Surama. That thing must not breathe the wholesome air of heaven. You know now what I told you. You know why such an entity can't be allowed on Earth. It won't be murder. Surama isn't human. If you're as pious as you used to be, James, I shan't have to urge you. Remember the old text, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, or something of the sort. Burn him, James. Don't let him chuckle again over the torture of mortal flesh. I say burn him, the nemesis of flame, That's all that can reach him, James, unless you can catch him asleep and drive a stake through his heart. Kill him, extirpate him, cleanse the decent universe of its primal taint, the taint I recalled from its age-long sleep. The doctor had risen on his elbow, and his voice was a piercing shriek toward the last. The effort was too much, however, and he lapsed very suddenly into a deep, tranquil coma. Dalton, himself fearless of fever, since he knew the dread germ to be non-contagious, composed Alfred's arms and legs on the lounge and threw a light afghan over the fragile form. After all, mightn't much of this horror be exaggeration and delirium? Mightn't old Doc McNeil pull him through on a long chance? The governor strove to keep awake and walked briskly up and down the room, but his energies had been taxed too deeply for such measures. A second's rest in the chair by the table took matters out of his hands, and he was presently sleeping soundly despite his best intentions. Dalton started up as a fierce light shone in his eyes, and for a moment he thought the dawn had come. But it was not the dawn, and as he rubbed his heavy lids, he saw that it was the glare of the burning clinic in the yard, whose stout planks flamed and roared and crackled heavenward in the most stupendous inferno he had ever seen. It was indeed the nemesis of flame that Clarendon had wished, and Dalton felt that some strange combustibles must be involved in a blaze so much wilder than anything normal pine or redwood could afford. He glanced alarmedly at the lounge, but Alfred was not there. Starting up, he went to call Georgina, but met her in the hall, roused as he was by the mountain of living fire.
The clinic's burning down. How is Al now?
He's disappeared. Disappeared while I dropped asleep,
replied Dalton, reaching out a steadying arm to the form which faintness had begun to sway. Gently leading her upstairs toward her room, he promised to search at once for Alfred, but Georgina slowly shook her head as the flames from outside cast a weird glow through the window on the landing.
He must be dead, James. He could never live, sane and knowing what he did. I heard him quarrelling with Surama and know that awful things were going on. He is my brother, but it is best as it is.
Her voice had sunk to a whisper. Suddenly through the open window came the sound of a deep, hideous chuckle, and the flames of the burning clinic took fresh contours till they half resembled some nameless cyclopean creatures of nightmare. James and Georgina paused hesitant and peered out breathlessly through the landing window. Then from the sky came a thunderous peal as a forked bolt of lightning shot down with terrible directness into the very midst of the blazing ruin. The deep chuckle ceased, and in its place came a frantic, ululent yelp as of 1,000 ghouls and werewolves in torment. It died away with long, reverberant echoes, and slowly the flames resumed their normal shape. The watchers did not move, but waited till the pillar of fire had shrunk to a smouldering glow. They were glad of a half-rusticity which had kept the firemen from trooping out, and of the wall that excluded the curious. What had happened was not for vulgar eyes. It involved too much of the universe's inner secrets for that. In the pale dawn, James spoke softly to Georgina, who could do no more than put her head on his breast and sob.
Sweetheart, I think he has atoned. He must have set the fire, you know, while I was asleep. He told me it ought to be burned, the clinic and everything in it, Surama too. It was the only way to save the world from the unknown horrors he had loosed upon it. He knew, and he did what was best. He was a great man, Georgie. Let's never forget that. We must always be proud of him, for he started out to help mankind and was titanic even in his sins. I'll tell you more sometime. What he did, be it good or evil, was what no man ever did before. He was the first and last to break through certain veils, and even Apollonius of Tyana takes second place beside him. But we mustn't talk about that. We must remember him only as the little Alf we knew, as the boy who wanted to master medicine and conquer fever.
In the afternoon, the leisurely firemen overhauled the ruins and found 2 skeletons with bits of blackened flesh adhering. Only 2, thanks to the undisturbed lime pits. One was of a man. The other is still a subject of debate among the biologists of the coast. It was not exactly an ape's or a saurian skeleton, but it had disturbing suggestions of lines of evolution, of which paleontology has revealed no trace. The charred skull, oddly enough, was very human and reminded people of Surama, but the rest of the bones were beyond conjecture. Only well-cut clothing could have made such a body look like a man. But the human bones were Clarendon's. No one disputed this, and the world at large still mourns the untimely death of the greatest doctor of his age, the bacteriologist whose universal fever serum would have far eclipsed Dr. Miller's kindred antitoxin had he lived to bring it to perfection. Much of Miller's late success, indeed, is credited to the notes bequeathed him by the hapless victim of the flames. Of the old rivalry and hatred almost none survived, and even Dr. Wilfred Jones has been known to boast of his association with the vanished leader. James Dalton and his wife Georgina have always preserved a reticence which modesty and family grief might well account for. They published certain notes as a tribute to the great man's memory, but have never confirmed or contradicted either the popular estimate or the rare hints of marvels that a very few keen thinkers have been known to whisper. It was very subtly and slowly that the facts filtered out. Dalton probably gave Dr. McNeill an inkling of the truth, and that good soul had not many secrets from his son. The Daltons have led on the whole a very happy life, for their cloud of terror lies far in the background, and a strong mutual love has kept the world fresh for them. But there are things which disturb them oddly, little things of which one would scarcely ever think of complaining. They cannot bear persons who are lean or deep-voiced beyond certain limits, and Georgina turns pale at the sound of any guttural chuckling. Senator Dalton has a mixed horror of occultism, travel, hypodermics, and strange alphabets which most find hard to unify. And there are still those who blame him for the vast proportion of the doctor's library that he destroyed with such painstaking completeness. McNeill, though, seemed to realize. He was a simple man, and he said a prayer as the last of Alfred Clarendon's strange books crumbled to ashes. Nor would anyone who had peered understandingly within those books wish a word of that prayer unsaid.